hidden in the heart of Manhattan on Fifth Avenue, where the world's wealthiest once built monuments to their power, stands a mansion that embodies a darker truth about American wealth. Not a castle on a remote hilltop, not a plantation estate hidden from view, but a palace placed deliberately, defiantly, in the most visible corridor of American capitalism. A mansion built by a man whose fortune was forged in blood and steel, whose name became synonymous with both industrial genius and ruthless violence. A place where beauty and brutality coexist, in marble halls, where European masterpieces hang on walls built with profits from broken strikes and shattered lives. This is the Frick Collection, and its story isn't just about art and architecture. It's about the price of empire, the cost of beauty, and one man's desperate attempt to buy redemption through culture when his soul had been sold to industry. The year is 1913. Henry Clay Frick is 64 years old. He has survived an assassination attempt, survived public hatred so intense that crowds would spit at his carriage, survived being called the most hated man in America after the Homestead Strike of 1892, where Pinkerton detectives hired by Frick opened fire on striking workers, killing 10 men and wounding dozens more. And now, with more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, with a collection of European art that rivaled any museum in the world, Henry Clay Frick made a decision. He would build a house. Not just any house, a mansion that would force New York society, the same society that had shunned him as a crude industrialist, a vulgar coal baron, a man with money but no breeding, to acknowledge his cultural sophistication. But here's where the story becomes fascinating. Frick didn't just want a mansion. He wanted immortality, and he knew exactly how to achieve it. The location he chose was Fifth Avenue and 70th Street, the most prestigious address in America. But this wasn't just about prestige. This was strategic. This was Frick placing himself literally across the street from the Frick mansion of his former partner and later bitter enemy, Andrew Carnegie. Two men who had built and steel empire together, who had turned on each other, who now would spend their final years glaring at each other across one of Manhattan's most famous avenues. The architecture would be designed by Thomas Hastings of Carrara and Hastings, the premier architectural firm of the Gilded Age, the same firm that designed the New York Public Library. Hastings understood what Frick wanted: not a home, but a monument, not a residence, but a museum that happened to have bedrooms. But here's what makes this story truly mysterious. Frick didn't build this mansion to live in. Not really. He was already 64 when construction began. He would only live there for 6 years before his death in 1919. So why spend millions in 1910s dollars on a mansion you'll barely inhabit? Because Frick was building for after death. He was constructing his own mausoleum, his own monument, his own version of history. The mansion came with a plan carefully detailed in Frick's will upon his death. The house would become a public museum. His art collection would be preserved exactly as he arranged it. Future generations would walk through his halls, admire his taste, and perhaps forget or forgive how that fortune was made. This wasn't a house. This was a calculated act of legacy building, an attempt to transform a reputation built on violence and exploitation into one of cultural patronage and refined taste. And the brilliant, disturbing part, it worked. The real purpose behind this structure wasn't shelter or comfort or even display of wealth. The purpose was resurrection, rebirth, transformation. Frick knew he couldn't change what he'd done, couldn't undo the deaths at Homestead, couldn't erase the hatred he'd earned, but he could build something so beautiful, so culturally significant that future generations might remember the art more than the bloodshed. Why this location? Why Fifth Avenue, the most public possible place for a private residence? Because Frick didn't want to hide. He wanted to be seen. I wanted to force society to acknowledge that the man they'd called a murderer, a tyrant, a monster, had created something worthy of preservation. The mansion sits on a full block between 70th and 71st Streets in Manhattan, a full city block. Do you understand the audacity of that? The expense, the declaration of power. In a city where every square foot is contested, where land is literally more valuable than gold, Frick claimed an entire block for his monument to himself. Construction began in 1913, But the story really starts decades earlier, because you can't understand this mansion without understanding the man who built it and the fortune that paid for it. Henry Clay Frick was born poor in Pennsylvania in 1849. By age 30, he'd become a millionaire through coke production, the processed coal used in steel manufacturing. He was ruthless, efficient, and absolutely devoid of sentimentality in business. When workers struck, he broke them. When competitors emerged, he crushed them. When partners became inconvenient, he disposed of them. In 1881, Andrew Carnegie brought Frick into his steel empire, recognizing in him a kindred spirit, someone willing to do whatever it took to maximize profit. For over a decade, they dominated American steel production, becoming two of the richest men in the world. But it was the Homestead Strike of 1892 that would define Frick's legacy and indirectly lead to this mansion. When workers at Carnegie's Homestead Steel Works demanded better wages, Frick responded with force. He hired 300 Pinkerton detectives, essentially private mercenaries, to break the strike. The resulting battle left 10 workers and 3 Pinkertons dead. The state militia was called in. The strike was crushed. An anarchist named Alexander Berkman, enraged by the deaths, burst into Frick's office and shot him twice, then stabbed him repeatedly. Frick survived. Famously, he finished his workday before seeking medical attention, wanting to show he couldn't be intimidated. But the incident hardened him in other ways. He became obsessed with legacy, with how he'd be remembered. He began seriously collecting art, European old masters, Renaissance paintings, French furniture. He studied culture with the same intensity he'd applied to coke production. He would transform himself from industrialist to estate, from capitalist to patron of the arts. The construction of the mansion was overseen with Frick's characteristic attention to detail and ruthless standards. Thomas Hastings designed a neoclassical structure that referenced Italian Renaissance palazzi, but with distinctly American proportions and modern conveniences. The exterior was Indiana limestone, giving the building a pale, almost luminous quality that stood out on Fifth Avenue. The construction timeline was relatively quick, from groundbreaking in 1913 to Frick's occupancy in 1914, just over a year. But that speed required enormous resources and perfect coordination. Every detail was specified by Frick himself. Every material was the finest available. Every craftsman was chosen for their expertise. The unique features of the design included galleries specifically built to showcase art. These weren't bedrooms converted to art display. They were purpose-built exhibition spaces disguised as residential rooms. High ceilings with skylights for perfect natural illumination. Walls covered in silk damask to complement the paintings. Floors of marble and rare woods. The mansion covered approximately 40,000 square feet on that full Manhattan block. It included a central courtyard, unusual for New York residential architecture, that brought light and air into the interior. This was a European sensibility applied to American urban density. The location's significance went beyond proximity to Carnegie. Fifth Avenue was where America's robber barons had built their monuments. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Whitneys. Frick was claiming his place among them, declaring that he belonged in this pantheon of wealth, regardless of how society judged his methods. But there was another calculation in the location. Frick knew that Fifth Avenue would remain prestigious, that the neighborhood would be protected, maintained, valued. He was building not just for his lifetime, but for centuries, and he chose a location that would ensure his monument's preservation. The challenges the builders faced were substantial. Manhattan construction is always complicated, bedrock close to the surface, neighboring buildings to consider, utilities to navigate. But the bigger challenge was meeting Frick's exacting standards while working at speed. Every material had to be perfect, every measurement precise, every detail exactly as specified. Frick supervised constantly, making changes, demanding revisions, accepting nothing less than perfection. He'd built an industrial empire through uncompromising standards. Now he applied those same standards to creating beauty. The irony is rich and disturbing. The fortune used to build this palace of culture came from an industry known for brutality. Steel mills where men worked 16-hour days in hellish conditions. Coal mines where workers died regularly from cave inns, explosions, and black lung disease. A business empire built on suppressed wages and broken unions. Every marble column, every gilded frame, every piece of Renaissance furniture was paid for by the sweat and blood and shortened lives of workers Frick never thought about except as production units to be maximized and costs to be minimized. And yet the mansion is beautiful, undeniably, breathtakingly beautiful. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. That something so aesthetically perfect could be built on something so morally compromised. Henry Clay Frick moved into his newly completed mansion in 1914 at age 65. With him came his wife Adelaide and their daughter Helen. Their other children, a son and daughter, had died young. Tragedies that had hardened Frick further and perhaps contributed to his obsession with creating a lasting legacy. But calling them the occupants misses the point. They didn't occupy this mansion the way normal families occupy homes. They were curating it, living inside a museum that hadn't officially become a museum yet. Every room was staged. Every piece of art was positioned for optimal viewing. Every detail was considered for how it would appear to future visitors. Adelaide, Frick understood her role. She was the lady of a great house, yes, but she was also the first curator of a collection that would outlive them all. She entertained carefully, selecting guests who would appreciate the art, who would validate Frick's transformation from industrialist to patron. Daughter Helen was being groomed as the eventual guardian of the collection. From early childhood, she was educated in art history, trained to understand and appreciate what her father had assembled. She would later become the primary force in establishing the Frick collection as an institution. The mansion played multiple roles, even in those early days. It was a private residence, yes, but it was also a social weapon. Every dinner party, every reception, every gathering was an opportunity for Frick to demonstrate that he belonged among New York's cultural elite. To walk through the Frick collection today is to experience cognitive dissonance. The rooms are intimate, human-scaled, designed to feel like a home. And yet everywhere you look, masterpieces worth hundreds of millions of dollars hang as casually as family photographs. Rembrandt, Vermeer, Titian, Bellini, Goya, El Greco. Not in a vast museum with crowds and velvet ropes, but in rooms that still feel like someone might walk in at any moment and sit down for tea. The mansion originally contained approximately 40 rooms across 3 floors. But these weren't typical mansion rooms. Every space served dual purposes: residential function and aesthetic presentation. The library wasn't just for reading. It was a gallery for English portraits. The dining room wasn't merely for meals. It was a showcase for French decorative arts. The West Gallery, the mansion's signature space, is perhaps the most revealing room in the entire structure. It's 70 feet long, with a barrel, vaulted ceiling, and skylights that flood the space with natural light. Along the walls hang some of the most important paintings in the collection: Vermeer's Officer and Laughing Girl, Rembrandt's Polish Rider, paintings by Velázquez, Hiles, Titian. But here's what's disturbing about this room. It's beautiful, perfectly proportioned. The light is sublime, the art is transcendent. And it was designed by a man who showed no mercy to workers, no compassion for strikers, no humanity when business demanded ruthlessness. How does someone capable of such brutality create such beauty, or commission it, at least? The answer might be that Frick didn't see any contradiction. In his worldview, both were expressions of power. Breaking strikes demonstrated his dominance in industry. Collecting masterpieces demonstrated his dominance in culture. Both were acquisitions. Both were victories. The living hall, the central space that visitors first enter, is finished in French limestone with Doric columns. It's modeled after Italian Renaissance courtyards, but enclosed and climate-controlled. A fountain plays at one end. Benches allow for contemplation. It's peaceful, meditative even. But the peace feels purchased like everything else in this mansion. The Fragonard room contains a series of decorative panels by Jean-Honor Fragonard called The Progress of Love. These panels were commissioned by Madame du Barry for Louis XV, but rejected as too frivolous. Frick bought them and built an entire room around them. The panels depict romantic courtship in idealized garden settings, all pastel colors and soft edges and gentle emotions. The contrast is almost obscene. Frick, whose fortune came from fire and molten steel, from strikes broken and workers crushed, surrounded himself with art depicting the most delicate, refined, emotionally gentle aspects of aristocratic French life. Was this aspiration compensation, or was it simply that Frick understood aesthetic value even if he couldn't embody the values those aesthetics represented? The Oval Room showcases Italian paintings and sculpture. The architecture here is more ornate, decorative moldings, rich fabrics, elaborate frames. It's a room designed to showcase not just individual works, but the idea of abundance, of having so much beauty that you can layer it, compound it, create environments where every surface offers something exquisite. The color palette throughout the mansion tends toward rich, warm tones, deep reds, warm golds, rich browns. These colors make the art glow, make the viewer feel embraced by luxury. But they also create a sense of enclosure, of protection. Frick's world was one of constant threat from competitors, from workers, from anarchists who wanted him dead. These rooms feel defensive, fortified, safe. The furniture was almost exclusively European antique pieces. French Louis XVI chairs, Italian Renaissance tables, English cabinets. Frick wasn't interested in American furniture, in supporting contemporary craftsmen, in developing native traditions. He wanted the cultural authority that came from owning pieces that had belonged to European aristocracy. Every room had its architectural features carefully considered. Fireplaces of rare marble, ceilings with delicate plasterwork, floors of inlaid wood or stone, windows positioned to maximize light while maintaining privacy. This was architecture in service of art, but also architecture as art itself. The dining room features English oak paneling and paintings by British masters, Gainsborough, Reynolds, Turner. Here, Frick entertained the cultural elite he'd courted so carefully. Here, served by staff who lived in quarters he never saw. He played the role of refined collector rather than industrial tyrant. There were no ballrooms in the traditional sense. Frick wasn't interested in massive social gatherings, in ostentatious parties. His entertaining was intimate, curated, controlled. Every guest list was strategic, every invitation calculated. This wasn't a social life, it was a campaign. The innovative design elements were subtle, but significant. The climate control system was state of the art for 1914, designed to protect the art collection. The lighting could be adjusted to showcase different works. The security was discreet, but comprehensive. Frick was building a museum masquerading as a home, and every detail reflected that dual purpose. What made this mansion stand out architecturally wasn't scale. There were larger mansions in New York. It wasn't ostentation. There were more elaborate palaces on Fifth Avenue. What made it remarkable was its perfect fusion of form and function, its commitment to creating spaces where art could be experienced intimately, personally, in ways museums don't allow. But underneath all that beauty, all that refinement, all that culture, there's something else, a coldness, a calculation. These rooms weren't designed for living. They were designed for legacy, for being preserved exactly as arranged, forever frozen in time as monuments to Frick's taste and wealth and desperate desire to be remembered for something other than Homestead. In Manhattan, outdoor space is the ultimate luxury, and Frick claimed not just outdoor space, but an entire garden, a private Eden in the heart of the city. The Fifth Avenue Garden, as it came to be known, was designed by landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., son of the man who designed Central Park. The elder Olmsted had democratized green space, creating parks for all New Yorkers. His son now designed a garden for one man, a garden no worker who'd labored in Frick's mills would ever see. The garden wasn't vast, it couldn't be, constrained by Manhattan's grid, but it was perfectly realized. Formal flower beds arranged symmetrically, carefully pruned trees providing shade and structure, a fountain as centerpiece, walking paths that allowed contemplation of the plantings and the mansion's facade simultaneously. The surrounding landscape was urban, obviously. Fifth Avenue on one side, 70th and 71st Streets on the others. But Frick's property created a buffer, a zone of quiet in a city of noise. The walls and hedges blocked street views. The fountain masked traffic sounds. Inside the garden, you could almost forget you were in Manhattan. Almost, but never entirely. because this garden, like everything else about the mansion, was a statement, a declaration that Frick commanded enough wealth and power to claim scarce Manhattan real estate for private pleasure, that he could afford to leave land undeveloped, unmonetized, purely for aesthetic purposes. The garden covered approximately half an acre, enormous by Manhattan standards. Some estimates suggest the land alone, at modern values, is worth over $100 million. That's how much Frick valued beauty, or perhaps that's how much he valued the demonstration of his ability to afford such beauty. The plantings were carefully chosen European species, English boxwood, French lavender, Italian cypress. Nothing native, nothing American. Everything imported, transplanted, maintained at great expense to survive in a climate they weren't designed for. Even the plants were acquisitions, expressions of Frick's ability to command and control nature itself. There were no famous gardens in the sense of vast landscape designs. This was an intimate space, meant for quiet contemplation rather than grand strolls, but its intimacy made it more precious, more exclusive. The Vanderbilts might have larger estates in the Hamptons, but in Manhattan, this garden was a jewel. Trees were limited by space, but chosen for symbolic weight, an oak representing strength, magnolias for their sculptural quality when in bloom, fruit trees whose blossoms marked the seasons. Each tree was specimen quality, purchased mature rather than planted young. Frick didn't have time to wait for trees to grow. The historical significance of the garden would become apparent only after Frick's death. When the mansion opened as a museum, the garden became part of the visitor experience. Not accessible directly, you couldn't walk in it, but visible through the windows, part of the aesthetic experience, a reminder of what wealth could create. Later, in the 1970s, when the Frick collection needed to expand, an addition was built. But here's what's remarkable: the garden was preserved, incorporated into the new design, protected, because by then it had become as much a part of the collection as the paintings, a living artwork, carefully maintained, forever frozen in its role as backdrop to Frick's legacy. The garden also served a practical purpose. It provided the natural light that flooded into the galleries through skylights and windows. That Frick understood that art needed light, that the best way to view paintings was in the kind of diffused daylight that gardens provide. So the garden wasn't just ornamental, it was functional, serving the mansion's true purpose as an art gallery. But there's something melancholic about this garden, something that speaks to the fundamental loneliness of Frick's life. He'd accumulated everything: wealth, art, property, culture, and yet he needed to build walls around it, protect it, keep the world out. The garden was beautiful, but it was also a fortress. Paradise with guards. The most significant transformation of the Frick mansion came not during Henry Clay Frick's lifetime, but after his death in 1919. Because that's when the mansion had to transform from private residence to public institution while somehow maintaining the intimate character that made it special. Frick's will was explicit and brilliant. The mansion and its art collection would become a public museum, but not immediately. His widow Adelaide would live there until her death. Only then would it open to the public. This gave the family time to prepare, to arrange, to perfect the presentation of Frick's legacy. Adelaide Frick lived in the mansion until 1931, 12 years after her husband's death. During this time, daughter Helen Clay Frick worked with trustees to plan the transformation. They faced a complex challenge. How do you convert a private home into a public museum while preserving the sense that you're visiting someone's residence? The answer was to change as little as possible. The art would stay where Frick had placed it. The furniture would remain. The rooms would keep their residential character, but infrastructure would need to be added: security systems, climate control, facilities for visitors, administrative offices. The mansion opened to the public in 1935, 16 years after Frick's death. The transformation was subtle but comprehensive. Certain private family quarters were closed off or repurposed. The bowling alley in the basement, yes, Frick had a bowling alley, was converted to art storage and administrative space, but the public rooms remained remarkably unchanged. What prompted these renovations wasn't just Frick's will. It was Helen's determination to cement her father's cultural legacy. She understood that the Homestead Strike would always be part of his story, but if the art collection was magnificent enough, if the museum was important enough, perhaps that would become the dominant narrative. And she was right. Today, most people who visit the Frick collection know little about Homestead. They know Frick as a collector, a patron, a man of refined taste. The renovation, or rather, the careful transformation, achieved exactly what it was designed to accomplish. Legacy management through architecture and art. The most significant physical change came in the 1970s, when the museum needed to expand. The challenge was maintaining the intimate character while adding gallery space. Architect Harry Van Dyke, with landscape architect Russell Page, designed a garden addition that was controversial but ultimately successful. The addition enclosed the garden court. The outdoor space became an indoor garden room, though still filled with plants and maintaining the feeling of outdoor space. This created a new lower level gallery while preserving the garden's visual presence. It was criticized by purists who wanted nothing changed, but it allowed the museum to grow while respecting Frick's original vision. Throughout these renovations, maintaining historical integrity was paramount. When fabrics needed replacement, they were reproduced exactly. When paintings needed conservation, it was done with period-appropriate techniques. The Frick collection wasn't just preserving art. It was preserving an entire environment, a specific moment in time. No significant rooms were altered in ways that changed their character. The West Gallery remained the West Gallery. The living hall maintained its fountain and columns. The Fragonard room kept its panels. Changes were infrastructural, new wiring, updated climate control, modern security, but invisible to visitors. This commitment to preservation was partly about respecting Frick's vision, but it was also strategic. The Frick collection's uniqueness comes from not feeling like a museum. It feels like visiting a very wealthy person's home. That intimacy, that sense of personal space, is what distinguishes it from the Metropolitan Museum, or MoMA. Changing too much would destroy that. Helen Clay Frick oversaw these changes until her death in 1984. She lived to see her father's mansion become one of New York's most beloved cultural institutions. She devoted her life to managing his legacy, and she succeeded beyond perhaps even her own expectations. The renovations and changes at the Frick weren't about modernization or adaptation. They were about careful, reverent preservation, about maintaining a specific vision of domestic elegance and artistic appreciation, about keeping alive a way of experiencing art that's increasingly rare in our contemporary museum culture. Let's be clear about something. The Frick collection is beautiful, it's culturally significant, it's architecturally important, and it was built on bodies. The fortune that purchased every painting, every sculpture, every piece of furniture came from an industry that treated human beings as expendable. Henry Clay Frick's wealth was blood money, accumulated through practices that would be criminal today and were morally indefensible even by the standards of his own time. The Homestead Strike of 1892 is the most famous dark chapter, but it wasn't the only one. Frick's coal mines had some of the worst safety records in Pennsylvania. His coke ovens poisoned workers with toxic fumes. His steel mills demanded such long hours that men literally died of exhaustion. When workers complained, they were blacklisted. When they organized, they were crushed. After Alexander Berkman's assassination attempt in 1892, Frick became even more paranoid and isolated. He surrounded himself with guards, trusted no one, saw every worker as a potential threat, every labor organizer as an enemy. The mansion on Fifth Avenue, with its walls and its controlled access, reflects that siege mentality. But here's the deeper darkness. Frick never expressed remorse, not for Homestead, not for the workers who died in his mines, not for the families destroyed when he broke strikes and blacklisted organizers. In his private letters, in his conversations with associates, he remained convinced he'd done what was necessary. That business required such actions. That sentiment had no place in industrial management. The mansion itself became a kind of fortress against this past. Frick rarely gave interviews. He controlled his public image meticulously. He donated to charities, carefully chosen charities that would enhance his reputation. He cultivated relationships with museum directors, art historians, cultural figures who would see him as a patron rather than a plutocrat. There are stories whispered among historians of servants who worked in the mansion and witnessed Frick's cold fury, of how he would berate staff for the smallest infractions, of how Adelaide and Helen walked on eggshells around him, never knowing what might trigger his anger. The mansion was beautiful, but it wasn't happy. Beauty and cruelty coexisted in those rooms, just as they coexisted in Frick himself. One particularly chilling aspect of the mansion's history: Frick's bedroom was designed with a secret exit, a hidden door that would allow him to escape if anarchists or angry workers somehow breached the mansion's security. Even in his private residence, even surrounded by art and luxury, Frick slept with one hand on an escape route. That's not the life of a man at peace with his conscience. The mansion also holds the secret of Adelaide's suffering. She lost 2 children. Her son Childs died at age 5. Her daughter Martha at just days old. These tragedies broke something in her. She became withdrawn, melancholic, finding solace in the art collection, but never quite recovering the joy of living. The mansion she lived in was filled with beauty, but it couldn't fill the void left by those losses. Helen Clay Frick's life holds its own darkness. She never married, devoted her entire existence to managing her father's legacy. Some historians suggest this wasn't entirely voluntary, that Frick had been so controlling, so dominating, that Helen never developed the capacity for independent life. She became the guardian of the collection, yes, but at what personal cost? There are rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, of artworks in the collection that were acquired through questionable means. European dealers in the early 1900s weren't always scrupulous about provenance. Some pieces may have been looted, stolen, or sold by families in financial distress who didn't understand their value. Frick asked few questions: if the price was right and the artwork authentic. The mansion has never been called haunted in the traditional sense. There are no ghost stories, no reports of supernatural phenomena. But there's something else, a heaviness. Visitors sometimes report feeling uncomfortable in certain rooms. Not frightened, just aware of something beneath the beauty. Some weight pressing down. Perhaps that's not supernatural. Perhaps it's just the psychological reality of standing in rooms built with money extracted from desperate, exploited workers. Perhaps it's the moral weight of art that was purchased not with honestly earned wealth, but with stolen lives, stolen hours, stolen health, stolen futures from thousands of men who never had a chance to visit a museum or appreciate a Rembrandt because they were too busy dying in Frick's service. There's another secret: the mansion holds the letters between Frick and Carnegie after their falling out. They're preserved in archives, but they reveal a bitterness, a hatred so intense it consumed both men. They'd been partners, maybe even friends. But when Carnegie tried to distance himself from the Homestead violence, when he let Frick take the full blame while Carnegie retreated to his castle in Scotland, Frick never forgave him. They lived across Fifth Avenue from each other for years, never speaking. Frick watching Carnegie's mansion, Carnegie watching Frick's. 2 of the richest men in history, consumed by mutual loathing, their wealth unable to purchase peace or forgiveness or reconciliation. That's a dark parable about what money can and cannot buy. The archives also contain correspondence about union organizers. Names of workers Frick had marked for termination and blacklisting, letters to Pinkerton discussing how to infiltrate unions. Documentation of Frick's systematic efforts to crush labor organizing. This wasn't passionate violence. This was calculated, methodical destruction of working class power, executed with the same efficiency he brought to every business venture. And here's perhaps the darkest secret: it worked. Frick got exactly what he wanted. He's remembered primarily as a collector and patron. The Frick collection is beloved. When people think of him, they think of art, not bloodshed. He successfully laundered his reputation through culture, transforming himself from monster to refined connoisseur through the simple expedient of buying enough beauty. That might be the most unsettling truth about the mansion, that it proves the power of wealth to rewrite history. That beauty really can obscure brutality if the beauty is magnificent enough. that we're willing to forgive almost anything if what we're asked to forgive it for is sufficiently impressive. When Henry Clay Frick died on December 2, 1919, he left behind a fortune FD valued at between $50 and $100 million, equivalent to several billion today. But more importantly, he left behind a plan, a meticulous, carefully crafted plan for how his wealth, his art, and his legacy would be managed after death. The mansion and its contents were bequeathed to a trust. The trustees, carefully chosen individuals, including daughter Helen, were given explicit instructions. The house was to be maintained exactly as Frick had arranged it. The art collection was never to be sold or dispersed. Upon Adelaide's death, the property would open as a public museum, maintaining its residential character while serving educational purposes. This wasn't a gift to the public. This was control from beyond the grave. Frick was dictating how he'd be remembered, how his art would be displayed, how future generations would experience his taste and judgment. Even in death, he couldn't relinquish control. Adelaide Frick lived in the mansion as a widow from 1919 to 1931. Those 12 years were spent preparing for the transformation. Helen worked with trustees and advisors to plan every aspect of the museum, which rooms would be public, how visitors would flow through spaces, what educational materials would be provided. Nothing was left to chance. When Adelaide died in 1931, the transformation could have begun immediately. But they waited, spent 4 more years preparing, renovating discreetly, setting up the administrative structure, training staff, establishing protocols. When the Frick collection finally opened to the public on December 16, 1935, it was perfect, or as perfect as human planning could achieve. The ownership structure was unusual. This wasn't a city museum or a private foundation in the conventional sense. It was a trust with a specific, unchangeable mission to maintain the mansion and collection exactly as Frick had intended. Trustees couldn't sell art to raise funds, couldn't change the residential character to create more gallery space, couldn't do anything that would violate Frick's original vision. This created both strength and limitation. The strength was consistency. The Frick collection would always be the Frick collection, unchanging in its essential character. The limitation was in flexibility as the art world evolved, as museum practices changed, as cultural expectations shifted. The Frick had to maintain its 1930s character. Helen Clay Frick became the collection's primary guardian. She never officially directed the museum. There were professional directors, but she wielded enormous influence. Every major decision required her approval. Every acquisition had to meet her standards. She was essentially channeling her father's judgment, trying to make choices he would have made. Over the decades, ownership technically remained with the trust, but management evolved. Professional museum administrators took increasing control. The board of trustees expanded beyond the Frick family. The institution had to balance Frick's vision with contemporary museum standards, donor expectations, and public service obligations. Famous figures became associated with the Frick collection as trustees or donors: the Rockefellers, the Mellons, other industrial fortunes that, like Frick's, needed cultural legitimacy. They found common cause in supporting an institution that proved wealth could be transformed into culture, that robber barons could become patrons. The political significance of the Frick collection was subtle but real. In the mid-20th century, as socialism and communism challenged capitalism, institutions like the Frick served as advertisements for what private wealth could accomplish. Look, they seem to say, at what great art collections capitalists create. Look at what they give to the public. The mansion became propaganda for capitalism's cultural contributions. Cultural icons visited regularly, artists studying the old masters, writers seeking inspiration, scholars researching art history. The mansion became a pilgrimage site for anyone serious about European painting. And each visitor, consciously or not, participated in Frick's legacy project, validating his taste, admiring his collection, perpetuating his cultural importance. No major political events occurred at the mansion after it became a museum. The drama was over. The violence was in the past. Now it was just art and beauty and quiet contemplation, which was exactly the transformation Frick had paid for. Today, the Frick collection stands as one of New York's most beloved cultural institutions, but it's also undergoing its most significant transformation since opening in 1935, a renovation and expansion that sparked intense debate about how we preserve historical spaces while meeting contemporary needs. In 2021, the mansion closed for a major renovation project expected to take several years and cost over $160 million. During this time, the collection moved to the Brewer Building on Madison Avenue. This temporary relocation gave New Yorkers a chance to see Frick's art in a completely different context, modernist architecture instead of Gilded Age opulence, and the contrast was striking. The renovation plans are ambitious and controversial. The mansion will be restored with careful attention to historical details, but new gallery spaces will be added. The visitor experience will be improved, better flow, more accessibility, modern amenities. The question everyone asks, can you expand and modernize while maintaining the intimate residential character that makes the Frick special? The architects, Seldorf architects, face an impossible challenge. Every addition or change will be criticized by purists who want nothing altered, but the mansion as it existed was never designed for the number of visitors it receives. Lines form outside. Rooms get crowded. The infrastructure is 1930s technology struggling with 21st century demands. The modern amenities being added include improved climate control, crucial for art preservation, better security systems, upgraded lighting that can be calibrated for different artworks, accessible entrances and facilities for visitors with disabilities, a new education center, conservation laboratories, all the infrastructure a contemporary museum needs, but that Frick never anticipated. But here's what won't change. The art will return to its original rooms. The West Gallery will still be the West Gallery. The Fragonard Room will keep its panels. The intimate scale, the residential feeling, the sense of visiting someone's magnificent home, all of that is being preserved as religiously as the paintings themselves. The Frick today is no longer privately owned in any meaningful sense. It's a public trust, governed by a board, subject to New York's nonprofit regulations, accountable to donors and the public. But the trust structure ensures that certain core principles remain inviolable. The collection cannot be sold or dispersed. The residential character must be maintained. Frick's vision, for better or worse, endures. The mansion has adapted to contemporary needs in subtle ways. Digital guides enhance the visitor experience without physical intrusion. The website provides extensive educational resources. Virtual tours allow global access. The Frick has entered the digital age while maintaining its analog soul. Current programming includes lectures, concerts, educational initiatives. The museum has become more than just a place to view art. It's a cultural center offering experiences Frick never imagined, but that serve his ultimate goal, establishing his cultural legacy. The institution has also begun, carefully and slowly, to acknowledge the complexity of Frick's legacy. Educational materials now mention Homestead. Lectures discuss the source of Gilded Age fortunes. There's a growing recognition that you can't fully appreciate the art without understanding how it was acquired, what paid for it, what moral compromises enabled such beauty. This is a delicate balance. The Frick collection doesn't want to be a monument to labor exploitation, but it can't entirely escape that history either. So they thread the needle, honoring the art and the collecting genius while acknowledging the human cost of the fortune that made it possible. The renovation, when complete, will feature a revitalized garden, not Frick's original garden that was enclosed in the 1970s, but a new outdoor space that recalls the original while serving contemporary purposes. A place for visitors to pause, reflect, and perhaps consider the complicated relationship between beauty and brutality that this mansion represents. So what does the Frick collection mean to us today? What can we learn from this monument to one man's desperate attempt to transform his reputation through culture? The impact on the surrounding community has been profound. The museum is a major cultural anchor for the Upper East Side. It brings visitors, supports local businesses, contributes to the neighborhood's identity as a center of art and culture. Property values in the area are partly sustained by proximity to such institutions. But the impact is also moral and philosophical. The Frick collection forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between wealth and culture. Can something built on exploitation nevertheless be valuable? Should we appreciate art while condemning how it was acquired? Is it possible to separate aesthetic achievement from moral compromise? The mansion remains a symbol of power and prestige, but what that symbolizes has shifted. In Frick's time, it represented the triumph of industrial capitalism, the idea that successful businessmen deserved their wealth, and that wealth naturally led to cultural refinement. Today, it represents something more ambiguous, the complicated legacy of the Gilded Age, when unprecedented wealth creation coincided with unprecedented inequality and exploitation. What can we learn from its history? Perhaps that beauty and brutality can coexist more easily than we'd like to admit. That wealth has the power to rewrite narratives, to transform reputations, to make us forget uncomfortable truths, if the consolation prize is magnificent enough. That art can serve as moral laundering, allowing the wealthy to purchase respectability when their business practices should have earned only contempt. But we can also learn something more hopeful, that even legacies built on control can evolve, that institutions created for one purpose can grow to serve others, that the public can reclaim what was meant to be private and transform it into something genuinely democratic and educational. The Frick collection attracts over 300,000 visitors annually in normal, non-pandemic, non-renovation years. Each visitor experiences something Frick intended, the intimate encounter with great art, but each visitor also experiences something he didn't intend, the democratization of beauty, the public's right to access cultural treasures regardless of their wealth or background. In that sense, we've subverted Frick's legacy even while honoring it. He wanted to control how we see him, but we've taken his art and made our own meanings from it. We visit his mansion not to validate his greatness, but to experience beauty that, regardless of how it was acquired, belongs to all of us now. The future of the Frick collection is both secure and uncertain. Secure because the trust structure and endowment ensure its survival. Uncertain because cultural values continue to evolve, and an institution that refuses to change risks becoming irrelevant. Already, there are calls for more diverse collecting, for acknowledging that European old masters aren't the only art worth preserving, for making the institution more inclusive and accessible. These pressures will only increase. The next generation may visit the Frick not primarily for the art, but as a historical site, a preserved example of Gilded Age values and aesthetics, studied more than celebrated. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the most honest legacy for the Frick collection is as a complicated monument to a complicated time, a place of extraordinary beauty that was built on extraordinary cruelty, a testament to both human aesthetic achievement and human moral failure, a reminder that we contain multitudes, that societies contain contradictions, that history is never simple. Henry Clay Frick wanted to be remembered as a great collector, a refined patron, a man of culture. He got his wish partially. We do remember the collection. We do admire the art. We do appreciate the mansion. But we also remember Homestead. We remember the workers who died building his fortune. We remember the strikes he broke, the families he destroyed, the ruthlessness he showed in pursuing wealth. He wanted to control his legacy. But legacy, in the end, isn't something you can control. It's something others decide about you after you're gone. When you can't defend yourself or spin the narrative or use your wealth to silence critics, the Frick collection endures, but not as pure validation of Henry Clay Frick's life. Instead, it stands as evidence of both what wealth can create and what it costs to create it, as proof that you can buy beauty but not virtue, acquire culture but not character, build monuments but not morality. On Fifth Avenue in the heart of Manhattan, behind limestone walls and iron gates, sits a mansion filled with masterpieces. Vermeers and Rembrandts and Titians that would be priceless even if we didn't know their history. But we do know their history. We know what paid for them. We know the broken bodies and shattered lives that financed their acquisition. And so we visit the Frick collection with both appreciation and discomfort. We admire the art while questioning its provenance, not just the legal provenance of which noblemen sold what painting, but the moral provenance of whose suffering financed the fortune that made such collecting possible, that discomfort is valuable. That questioning is healthy, because if we simply admired the beauty without acknowledging the brutality, we'd be complicit in Frick's legacy laundering. We'd be helping him get away with it, validating his strategy of using culture to obscure violence. Instead, we can hold both truths simultaneously. The art is magnificent. The fortune that acquired it was blood money. Both statements are true. Both must be remembered. The Frick collection's greatest legacy might not be the art it preserves. It might be the questions it forces us to confront about wealth, power, culture, and morality, about whether beauty can redeem cruelty, about whether museums can exist outside the economic systems that create them, about our own complicity when we admire art without questioning where it came from and what it cost. As the mansion reopens after renovation, as a new generation discovers its treasures, these questions will only become more pressing. We live in a time of renewed attention to inequality, of questioning how great fortunes are made and whether their makers deserve honor or condemnation. The Frick collection can't escape those questions. It embodies them. Every painting is a paradox, every room a contradiction, every visit an education in how uncomfortable truth can coexist with undeniable beauty. Henry Clay Frick wanted immortality. He got it. But not the kind he imagined, not pure celebration, not unambiguous admiration. Instead, he achieved something more complex and perhaps more honest, a legacy that forces us to think deeply about the costs of civilization, the price of beauty, and the moral compromises that underlie so much of what we consider cultural achievement. That's not the immortality he paid for, but it might be the immortality we need him to have. The mansion stands, the art endures, the questions remain, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. To err as you stand in the West Gallery, as Vermeer's light falls across a canvas painted 300 years ago, as you contemplate beauty that was purchased with wages stolen from men who never saw a masterpiece, ask yourself, what monuments are we building today? And what legacies are we creating? And when future generations stand in our museums, in our institutions, in the buildings we've constructed, what uncomfortable questions will they ask about us?